Hi again, folks. Welcome back to Kilohearts. George here with a very special guest. Dash Glitch is here to talk about his new content bank, Astral Beings. Welcome, Dash. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks, George. How are you?
I'm doing all right, thank you. Yeah, it's all a bit weird, this working from home stuff. But,
Yeah, tell me about it. Well, I can't really comment because that's kind of like what I do, but
oh, well, yeah. Before we start talking specifically about the bank, can I ask you a few questions just about your background, your musical journey, your life in general? Can you fill us in with the potted history?
yeah. I started, well, my sort of experience with synthesizers goes back very far into my youth. My father was like in bands, he played keyboards, so he had a couple of synths like lying around the house. So I had exposed to synths at a very young age, which I was very kind of lucky to have. I didn't really sort of understand the power at that point. I mean, it was just like siren noises and that kind of thing. And so I kind of didn't appreciate it at that point and kind of got more into more traditional music, piano and drums, more specifically drums. I mean, I kind of fell off from piano for a bit. I'm not particularly good at playing, so I guess that's probably why. And then, as I started getting older, I started listening to kind of more experimental music and then hearing these kind of weird synthy sounds being used in traditional music and thinking like, oh, wait, that's a synth sound. I know how to make that. And so I kind of started experimenting a little bit with Fruity Loops back in the day. Also started attending Psytrance festivals, and that kind of like sort of influenced me into getting into that genre. And yeah, pretty much from there, decided that music was my life. And I went to study sound engineering. And a couple of years after that, I worked, doing sound engineering and kind of live gigs and that kind of thing, which I wasn't really too keen on. In the back of my mind, I kind of always thought I want to be a producer, I want to be a sound designer, because I'd really enjoyed that kind of experimentation, just making weird noises, with these things that I didn't really know what they were, when I was a kid and stuff. So fast forward a few years, I worked in retail, actually in a music shop, selling mainly in the synth and studio department. So I sold retail studio equipment for about 10 years. And that was a lot of fun. I learned a ton about different gear, just about the industry, about marketing and promotion, most especially. I think that was the important thing that I took away from that whole experience. And also networking. I met a lot of people in the industry because I'm also, as I'm sure a lot of people in the industry or a lot of producers are, I'm quite an introverted person. It might not seem like that online, but so working in the industry kind of like forces you into that, So that was a great networking experience. And, after a while doing that, I kind of thought, I can go my own way and try this tutorial thing. At that point, I had seen a lot of guys doing, I think there was Mr. Bill and Seamless were the big ones that I was watching. And I thought, there's nobody really doing Psytrance stuff like what they do. He did the how does Skrillex make that bass and how does this guy make that this. And so I thought, if somebody could break down like a Psytrance track, I'm sure it would help a lot of people. And so I started doing these videos very primitively, like shot on my phone with an app that you can kind of still see the watermark in the corner. And yeah, things just kind of like avalanched from there. Ended up getting so many requests of people to say, hey, you should release a Serum sound pack. Hey, you should release this sound pack for this and this. And so I started putting together sound packs and releasing them just by myself on my Shopify page that I had put together. And yeah, things just kind of avalanched from there. And here we are today with a Kilohearts content bank.
Yeah, and we're delighted that you've made it all this way. I wanted to ask you about Psytrance specifically. You mentioned you went to some festivals and got really into it. Is it as simple as that? That was what led you into this particular area? Is it a sort of a social thing as much as a musical thing? Or was there something specific about the sounds and the music itself that entranced you?
I think it was kind of this like like awakening to the fact that these kind of weird synthy sounds could be used in a musical context, because I guess at that point, stuff that was like heavily sound design oriented stuff hadn't really developed. So we hadn't really got like Skrillex and that kind of stuff yet. So when I first kind of like delved into Psytrance, it was like I started hearing these weird siren-y noises and that kind of thing that I had experimented with synths and used in a context which still sounded groovy. It sounded like traditional music. So it was kind of this like, oh, this is allowed. We're allowed to make weird noises and people dance to this.
I suppose at the beginning, the sort of Goa trance era, the 90s, we're still looking at music in, house and mainstream dance music that was piano, bass, drums, vocals. It was very traditional in a lot of ways. So I suppose, as you say, these kinds of experimental sounds as music were only emerging at the time. And
absolutely.
Well, that's fascinating. And of course, a lot of these sounds are coming through in your content bank. Would you say that Astral Beings is a very representative sound collection for the genre of Psytrance, or is it your personal interpretation? How progressive is it, so to speak?
Well, I guess it's a kind of a homage to kind of like the history of Psytrance. So, when I was first getting into it, it hadn't really developed to the kind of modern stage where it is today. Things were still a little bit primitive in terms of like the synths that people had and, the kind of software that they had. So, I mean, like wavetable synthesis, for example, those kind of really complex tones wasn't really a popular thing. So until a little bit later on down the line, obviously, I mean, there was stuff like the Waldorf synths and stuff which had wavetable capabilities, and some artists were using them, but it wasn't really a staple sound. I mean, the staple sounds were the saw waves, the acid leads, that kind of stuff. So already straight off the bat, when I started with the bank, my idea was to try craft the sounds using these kind of like basic building blocks. Just a basic saw wave, and then work at how it's processed, how the distortions are affecting the sound, and maybe run it through several different filters and that kind of thing. Because I think, in the early days, that's kind of like how a lot of the sound design was created. They didn't really have access to these really complex wavetables and that kind of thing. I mean, obviously there is some complex modern stuff in there, but the kind of idea behind a lot of the stuff when I started was keep things simple and work at like processing it in interesting ways.
That's fascinating. Yeah, because it's a completely different approach to a lot of people's approach with Faceplant, which is to treat it as a straight down the middle wavetable synth and just see how much you can wring out of the wavetables. So to use the effects a lot and to use different kinds of generators, I suppose, was a challenge, but something that you thought was worth doing. So my next question
Absolutely.
for you then is, did you have any particular snap-ins that you found you went back to for a lot of different sounds? Were there some that became your favorites through the process of making this?
So again, like I said, I try to keep within the theme of kind of the history of Goa and Psytrance in that, the building blocks were pretty simple. So I tried not to complicate things with like stacks of disperser and that kind of stuff. I try to like keep things simple with just traditional filters, maybe 2 or 3 of those, some EQs and that kind of things, reverbs, and more play with the way that they interact and the modulations and that kind of thing. So I would say probably the most used snap-in in the bank is probably the filter. Just the traditional filter, just because, having the versatility of a clean filter, you can always create stacks of them, and you can have a peak and a high pass to create like a dirty band passy sound, So
absolutely, this is something if I may say, I found just wonderful about the modern music making world is sometimes it's the simplest tools that are the most fun to work with, because they present unique but comprehensible challenges in the way that you build with them and combine them and have them interact with each other that I think a lot of people, if you're using more complex tools, you kind of treat them like a black box. You slap something on and you go, I don't really know how that works, but it sounds cool. And your approach obviously is a lot different.
Yeah, well, that's also one of the reasons why I kind of appreciate Faceplant so much, is that everything in it has a very similar user interface approach. Whereas I find a lot of the stuff you really have to know your way around the things to actually dive in and create, for example, to create a content bank for, because now at this point I've created quite a few for various synths, and I always find there's a lot of setup that you have to do beforehand to get these things, but just the way that the interface works and everything is just so fluid that I found it's so easy to just stack up these very simple building blocks, and you didn't really have to learn a new Snapin and what it does to just put it in and tweak it a little bit. So there was a lot of experimentation as well in that point, just trying new things, because I feel like the simplicity of the interface is also very important, I think, and in why the things sound so good, I guess.
Yeah, but that's great to hear. That's great to hear, Dash. I'm glad that you enjoyed it. That puts me in mind of one of the key elements that the guys here at Kilohearts had in mind when designing Faceplant, which is that it shouldn't be impenetrable. It should be something that people can understand, but also something that can help people to learn about synthesis and about sound design and sound processing. And it sounds from the approach you've described there as if you, first of all, enjoy learning from the sound design projects that you take on. But do you also consider yourself something of an educator? Do you make videos to share knowledge and to show people new approaches? Because a lot of people use YouTube particularly to copy and paste and show people, hey, this is how someone else made this thing. But are you approaching it as a kind of investigative educator, do you say?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, I kind of like put on two hats, when I'm creating my music and performing my music. I kind of like take off the educator hat a little bit, just because I find often when I'm kind of, specifically if I'm working on a project where I'm breaking down a particular artist's music. If I just straight after that start working on my own track, I'll find myself using a lot of the elements which I might not necessarily in the end want to incorporate into my personal music and stuff like that. So I find it's important to kind of wear two different hats, and when I'm an educator, try not to work on too much of my own music. But I guess it kind of comes hand in hand, because having the channel and that kind of thing has kind of pushed me to make more music, because now there's a kind of expectation I have to put up content. So it's like, oh, I've got to think of something new. So I end up working on a bass line and a percussion loop so that I can show a synth. And it's like, okay, well, I'm gonna scrap that synth, but now I've got a track that I can work on. So it's kind of created this momentum for me when I'm wearing the artist hat, which I really appreciate. So they work hand in hand really well.
That's really interesting. So it's one of the... Go ahead,
mainly
sorry.
Now, I think I wear the educator hat a lot more, but I definitely appreciate the performance aspect and the music aspect. I think that's kind of why I do it. But at the end of the day, as an artist, I'm sure there's a lot of people who relate to this. I kind of struggle with making that final decision. Is this sound perfect for this track, or is this track perfect to release? So I end up making a bunch of sounds and making a bunch of ideas that might not end up seeing fruition. And to be able to turn that into something that other people can use, I think is invaluable. So for me, often it's like I make 3 or 4 videos with a particular track that I'm working on, and maybe only one sound might end up in the final track. It might not even, but so many people are benefiting from just those 4 examples of me either experimenting or trying to achieve a particular sound, that I think that's powerful.
Absolutely. And the community of music makers and sound designers is becoming so symbiotic these days, and so many of the listeners are also creators and everyone who is making is also watching and listening, and there's a real kind of sharing going on, I think. And so content banks and presets and sharing sounds like this is a really important part of that, because as you say, it's partly offering ideas and education to the audience of that content bank, but it's also partly about inspiring yourself to come up with new things and to come at things from different angles. I imagine that must be a really positive side of working with lots of different products and companies, that you have different approaches forced upon you a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. When I first started experimenting with Phaseplant, it was a bit different because of the whole homogeneous, gooey kind of thing with the Snapins. So it was a little bit different because I'm so used to like different things being represented. So kind of like obviously with an interface, So it took a little bit of time getting used to, but once I had kind of like been forced into that, and I was like, okay, now let me create an entire track using only Phaseplant. Then it's like, then you start to see, you push the boundaries and that kind of thing. So, having the ability to try new things from different developers always forces you into that, because, for example, like I was saying to you before the conversation, like the TB303, not this exact one, but this is just a replica. It's such a limited thing that it forces you into a specific kind of paradigm. And I think that is powerful for various reasons, that, you end up making a lot of music quickly. So there's definitely benefits to being forced into different things. Yeah.
Yeah, the trouble is thinking every option in the world is open to you, and then you never choose one. That's always been an issue that I've found in myself and seen and heard in a ton of other people, is that now the world is so open and access to these tools is so easy, it becomes very difficult to force yourself down a path and to really make a decision and go forward. And yet you've managed to come up with all kinds of wonderful things within what I would perceive as someone who's not a super intense electronic music expert, as quite a narrow niche of Psytrance. It's up there in the branches of the musical family tree. It's not perhaps, I'm sure there's all kinds of subgenres and smaller families within the area, but let me ask you specifically about the sounds in this bank, in your new Kilohearts content bank. Are there specific people that this should appeal to? Are there people with particular goals that should be interested in this bank?
Well, I tried to cover all the bases. So, there's sounds or presets to craft your kick drum and your bass, and very basic kind of percussion loops and that kind of thing. A lot of the time, the people that are buying packs often just need a lead sound for their track. They just need a hook. They just need a sequence or a lead. That's why they're looking for these sounds. But also a lot of the time, it's beginners that are just getting into it for the first time, and they're watching all these tutorials, and they're just like, they can't follow along. So they really need that little bit of a help to get a kick drum sounding good. So I tried to balance it out between, there's leads that can just finish a track, or a sequence that can just add that little bit of something to finish something off, but also the very bare bone basics, the clean kick drum, clean bass sound, percussion-y type of loops and that kind of thing. So, it's a little bit of everything. It kind of appeals to everybody. There's, like I said, very much inspired by the history of Psytrance and Goa and that kind of thing. So you can very much hear that in a lot of the sounds, but there's still very modern stuff as well, like the more high-techy FM and sort of more sharper saw sounding leads and that kind of thing that'll cut through the more modern stuff, I guess.
Hey, that's wonderful. Yeah. So it's a good all-around take on the genre for people who are interested.
Yeah, absolutely. I try with most of my products to try incorporate a bit of everything, unless it's like a specific loops or sequence type of thing. I try, like I said, most people aren't looking for a kick or a bass. They've got all the samples that they need, but just having that in an extra, preset or something for somebody to mess around with, or even just break apart to learn for themselves. I think that's also very important. My experiments getting into it for the first time, I was also finding it a bit hard to follow along to some of the guys because of software differences and all that thing, kind of stuff. But having a preset and actually looking at it and piecing it apart, that's a whole nother inspiration game,
Absolutely. I was going to say, even just the educational value of a preset which breaks down a process is huge. Even if you never use that preset in a track, just to be able to see how someone has approached making that sound. I kind of think that's essential as a learning tool in coming into a new style or a new area of sound design, that you can pick apart the basics, and that allows you then to move on and make tweaks. It's like, you've got to know the rules before you break them. So perhaps there's some really good stuff in terms of breaking down the basics in this content bank as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, there's sort of more basic percussion loop type of things where you can just hold down a single note on the MIDI keyboard and it'll add a percussion loop to a track. I guess that's another thing that often I struggle with, is to just lay down the basics and then start crafting the tone of the track. I think that's a very important thing. I mean, we can all make a bass sound, we can all make simple kick sounds and that kind of thing, but a track's going to sound different because of the tones of the leads and that kind of thing. And having just a sound which you can pop in, move on, pop in, move on, percussion loops done. Now we can start creating some sounds for that, I think is a huge workflow improvement. Cool.
Wonderful. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dash. I think we'll leave it there if that's cool with you. I wanted to let the audience know that there is a video on your channel, on Dash's own channel, breaking down the particular sounds in the content bank in a lot more detail, and speaking about how he's using them in the tracks. Do you want to tell us just a tiny bit about that video, and then everyone can go and see it for themselves, I guess?
Yeah. So the video, it's the idea with the video was for me to show off a bunch of the sounds that I've crafted for this content bank, but also show how you could change the sounds, like how versatile they are. For example, there's a bunch of sequences in the bank, one particular one which is a kind of 303 inspired sequence, and in the video, my idea was to show you that you don't have to use it as a sequence. So I just disabled some of the LFOs, played in a MIDI, and now it's completely flipped the sort of the idea of that sound. And so the idea with the video is for me to show how you can flip these things around, put your own sort of little spark on sounds, and show you how I would use certain things in context, but also just the idea of the versatility, and also how few sounds I use to fill up the entire track. I think that's the important thing about a lot of these sounds, is they're very, a lot of the time I find with when I'm creating sounds is I have to think in context of how would it sound in a full mix when they've processed it with all these things. But because of all the snap-ins and all that kind of stuff, is you can get so much out of Phase Plant that you can almost get a full mix. So it's kind of like a lot of that work is done, so it fills up really nicely, and I wanted to show that in the creation of the track and the video.
Hey, that's wonderful to hear. I'll be heading over to watch that right away, and we encourage you all to do the same. Hey, thanks so much, Dash. It's been great speaking to you, and we'll look forward to speaking to you again sometime soon. Maybe we can get you back over to have another chat sometime soon.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me. See you guys.
Great work on the content bank. That's Astral Beings, available from the Kilohearts website now, so go check it out. Thanks very much, Dash. Thank you for watching. See you all again soon.